The Lindbergh kidnapping case, one of the most infamous criminal investigations in American history, began on the night of March 1st, 1932, when 20-month-old Charles Lindbergh Jr., son of famed aviator Charles Lindbergh and his wife Anne Morrow Lindbergh, was abducted from their secluded home in East Amwell, New Jersey. The case shocked the nation and quickly became a media sensation. It was dubbed the crime of the century, capturing public attention and sparking national outrage. What followed was a highly publicized investigation, a dramatic trial, and an execution that left lingering questions and mysteries. 1. The abduction. On the evening of March 1st, 1932, Charles Lindbergh Jr. was put to bed by his nursemaid, Betty Gow, at approximately 7:30 p.m. He was sleeping in his crib in his room on the second floor of the family's house, Highfields. At around 10 p.m., Betty checked on the child and found that he was gone. The window was open, and a ladder was placed against the house, suggesting that someone had climbed up to take the child. This was the first clue that the abduction had been carefully planned. A ransom note demanding $50,000 was found, marking the beginning of the nightmare for the Lindbergh family. The note read, "We have your boy and we are waiting for the ransom." The family immediately contacted the police and the investigation began. But despite the authorities' swift actions, there were few leads in the case. 2. Early investigation and efforts to trace the kidnappers. The case quickly gained national attention, and a massive investigation was launched by local police, private detectives, and the newly formed FBI. The Lindberghs' immense public profile ensured that the case became a media spectacle. The police questioned numerous individuals, and many tips poured in from across the country, but none of them led to a breakthrough. In the weeks that followed, a second ransom note was received by the Lindberghs, giving more details about how the money would be exchanged. The authorities began tracking the ransom money, but the kidnappers appeared to be extremely cautious, and no substantial progress was made. The investigation seemed to stall. 3. The discovery of the body. On May 12, 1932, 2 months after the kidnapping, the body of Charles Lindbergh Jr. was discovered in a wooded area, just 4 miles from the Lindbergh home. The child's body was badly decomposed, and forensic experts determined that he had been dead for some time. The cause of death was a blow to the head, and it was clear that he had been murdered shortly after the abduction. The discovery of the body marked a tragic turning point in the investigation. While the Lindberghs held on to hope for their son's return, the reality of his death had now set in. This discovery spurred the authorities to intensify their efforts to track down the criminals responsible for this horrific crime. The search for the killer. After the discovery of the body, the investigation shifted to finding the perpetrators of the crime. Law enforcement increased their efforts to track down any leads, but for months, no new evidence surfaced. The public, meanwhile, was captivated by the case, and there were numerous theories about the identity of the kidnappers. The breakthrough came in 1934 when investigators began focusing on the ransom money. One of the $20 gold certificates from the ransom was traced to a local store in the Bronx, New York. The man who had spent the money was identified as Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a German immigrant and carpenter. Hauptmann was arrested in the September 1934, and evidence linking him to the crime began to mount. 5. The arrest of Bruno Richard Hauptmann. Hauptmann's arrest was a significant development in the case. A carpenter by trade, Hauptmann had immigrated to the U.S. from Germany and was in financial trouble at the time of the kidnapping. He had been living in the Bronx, New York, and working on various construction projects. When police searched his home, they found a stash of the ransom money in his garage. Furthermore, Hauptmann's fingerprints were found on one of the ransom notes, linking him directly to the crime. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Hauptmann maintained his innocence. He claimed that he had found the ransom money in a garage and that he had been framed by the real kidnappers. The authorities, however, were confident that Hauptmann was the mastermind behind the abduction and murder. 6. The trial of Bruno Hauptmann. The trial of Bruno Hauptmann became a national media sensation. It was one of the first major trials covered extensively by the media, and it captivated the American public. The prosecution presented a strong case, showing that Hauptmann had spent the ransom money, that his fingerprints were found on the ransom notes, and that a ladder matching the one used in the abduction had been found in his possession. Hauptmann's defense team argued that he had been framed, but the evidence presented at trial was damning. The jury deliberated for several days before finding Hauptmann guilty of both kidnapping and murder. On February 13, 1935, he was sentenced to death. The trial, while a victory for the prosecution, left lingering questions about the fairness of the process. Some believed that Hauptmann had been convicted too quickly without sufficient consideration of his defense. 7. The execution and lingering doubts. On April 3, 1936, Bruno Hauptmann was executed by electrocution in New Jersey's state prison. His execution was the final chapter in a case that had captured the nation's attention for more than 4 years. However, many people still questioned whether Hauptmann was truly guilty. Some believed he had been framed, while others suggested that he may have been an unwitting accomplice in a larger criminal conspiracy. The questions surrounding Hauptmann's guilt continued to haunt the case. His defense team had argued that the evidence against him was purely circumstantial, and that the prosecution had failed to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. But despite the doubts, Hauptmann was executed, and the case was considered closed. 8. The legacy of the case. The Lindbergh kidnapping had far-reaching consequences for both American law enforcement and the public's understanding of criminal justice. In response to the case, Congress passed the Lindbergh Law in 1932, which made kidnapping a federal crime if the victim was taken across state lines. This law gave the federal government greater power to investigate and prosecute kidnappings, and it became a critical tool in the fight against organized crime. The case also sparked a national conversation about the role of the media in criminal investigations. The relentless media coverage of the Lindbergh case had created a frenzy that some believed interfered with the judicial process. It raised questions about how public opinion could influence legal proceedings, and it highlighted the dangers of sensationalism in the media. Even after Hauptmann's execution, the case continued to captivate the public's imagination. Many books, documentaries, and films have been made about the case, and conspiracy theories about the true identity of the kidnappers continue to persist. Some believe that Hauptmann was innocent and that the true criminals were never caught, while others speculate that the Lindbergh family was involved in a cover-up. 9. Unanswered questions and conspiracy theories. Despite the conviction and execution of Bruno Hauptmann, Many questions about the case remain unanswered. Conspiracy theories have continued to circulate, suggesting that Hauptmann was a scapegoat and that the real criminals were never brought to justice. Some believe that Hauptmann was part of a larger criminal conspiracy that included other individuals and that he may have been framed to protect the true perpetrators. There are also theories that suggest that the Lindbergh family was involved in a cover-up, either out of fear of scandal or because they knew more about the crime than they let on. However, these theories remain speculative and have never been proven. The impact on American society and law enforcement. The Lindbergh kidnapping case had a profound impact on American society and law enforcement. It brought the issue of child safety into the public consciousness and led to changes in how kidnapping cases were handled. The case also highlighted the importance of forensic evidence and the role that the media plays in shaping public opinion. The federal government, under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, used the case as an opportunity to strengthen the FBI's role in investigating major crimes. The Lindbergh kidnapping marked the beginning of the FBI's involvement in high-profile criminal cases, and it helped establish the agency as a key player in national law enforcement. 11. The continuing fascination with the case. The Lindbergh kidnapping case remains one of the most famous and debated criminal cases in history. It continues to capture the public's imagination, with countless books, documentaries, and articles written about it. The case has become a symbol of the intersection between celebrity, crime, and justice, and it has left a lasting legacy in American legal history. Despite the passage of time, many questions about the case remain unresolved. Was Bruno Hauptmann the true perpetrator, or was he an innocent man wrongfully convicted? Who were the real kidnappers, and what was their motive? These questions continue to spark debate and speculation, ensuring that the Lindbergh kidnapping will remain a mystery for years to come. Conclusion. The Lindbergh kidnapping case is a powerful reminder of the fragility of life and the complexities of the justice system. It is a case that continues to raise questions about fairness, the role of the media, and the nature of crime. Whether or not Bruno Hauptmann was guilty, the case has had a profound and lasting impact on American society, law enforcement, and the public's understanding of criminal justice. The Lindbergh case is more than just a historical event. It is a symbol of the search for truth and justice in the face of tragedy. The role of media in the Lindbergh case. The Lindbergh kidnapping case was one of the first to be covered extensively by the media, and it demonstrated the power of the press in shaping public opinion. Newspapers across the United States covered every aspect of the case, from the initial abduction to the arrest and trial of Bruno Hauptmann. The case became a national obsession, and the public followed each new development closely. Newspapers such as the New York Daily News, Chicago Tribune, and Los Angeles Times provided daily updates on the case, often publishing sensationalized stories about the Lindberghs' search for their son and the investigation into the crime. Some reporters went so far as to speculate on the guilt or innocence of Hauptmann before the trial even began. This created a climate in which public opinion was shaped by the media, and many people formed strong beliefs about the case based on the reports they read. The intense media scrutiny led to a sense of urgency and drama, which may have influenced the behavior of law enforcement, attorneys, and even jurors. In the 1930s, the media had a far-reaching influence, and the Lindbergh case was a prime example of how journalism could amplify a crime to legendary status. The constant media coverage also placed immense pressure on the police and prosecutors to solve the case quickly. Public expectations were high, and the authorities felt compelled to deliver justice. The media's portrayal of Hauptmann as a villain may have influenced how the case was handled, including the speed at which the trial took place. Many legal experts have since pointed out that Hauptmann may not have received a fair trial due to the overwhelming media attention. 13. The public's perception of the Lindbergh family. Throughout the investigation and the subsequent trial, public perception of the Lindbergh family played a significant role. The Lindberghs, particularly Charles Lindbergh, were already famous before the kidnapping. Lindbergh was a national hero for his pioneering solo flight across the Atlantic, and the Lindberghs were seen as the epitome of American success and family values. This status made their son's kidnapping even more poignant. The Lindberghs' suffering was deeply felt by the American public, and their pain became symbolic of the loss of innocence in a rapidly changing world. As the investigation unfolded, the public sympathized with them, but this sentiment was not universally shared. Some critics, especially in the media, began questioning the Lindberghs' role in the case. There were rumors that Lindbergh himself had been involved in the crime, either accidentally or through a cover-up, though these were never substantiated by evidence. The Lindberghs were thrust into a bizarre paradox. While they were mourned as victims, they also became targets of suspicion. This created a dissonance in the public's view of them, as they were both seen as grieving parents and, in some people's eyes, potential accomplices in a much larger plot. However, the overwhelming public sympathy for their tragedy eventually prevailed, and they were ultimately seen as the victims of an unspeakable crime. 14. The Lindbergh Law. The aftermath of the Lindbergh kidnapping had a profound impact on American law. In 1932, the U.S. Congress passed the Lindbergh Law, which made kidnapping a federal offense when the victim was taken across state lines. The law was intended to help prevent cases like the Lindbergh kidnapping, where the crime spanned multiple jurisdictions and law enforcement agencies struggled to coordinate efforts. Before the Lindbergh Law, kidnapping was primarily handled by state authorities, and there was no national framework for tackling such crimes. The case demonstrated the necessity for a coordinated federal response to kidnappings, especially when the crime involved high-profile individuals or occurred across state boundaries. The Lindbergh Law marked a significant shift in how kidnappings were prosecuted and represented a major step forward in the federal government's involvement in criminal investigations. In addition to the law itself, the Lindbergh kidnapping also spurred changes in how law enforcement approached missing children cases. The FBI became more involved in the investigation of missing persons, and specialized teams were created to handle cases of abductions. The law would remain in effect for decades, helping authorities track down and prosecute kidnappers who crossed state lines. 15. The psychological profile of the kidnapper. The Lindbergh kidnapping case also fascinated criminologists and psychologists who sought to understand the motivations and psychology of the kidnapper. Why would anyone abduct a child, especially the child of a famous and wealthy family? Psychologists studying the case often speculated that the kidnapper was someone with deep psychological issues. Some argued that the abduction was not just about money, but about the power and control that came with taking such a high-profile victim. The motive for the kidnapping could have been a combination of greed, desperation, and a desire for recognition. There were several theories about who the kidnapper might have been and what kind of person would commit such a crime. Some experts suggested that the criminal could have been a psychopath driven by a need for power and control, while others speculated that the kidnapper might have been someone with a deep-seated resentment toward the Lindberghs or the famous aviator. Despite the investigation's success in catching Bruno Hauptmann, questions about the psychological profile of the kidnapper lingered. Was Hauptmann the mastermind, or was he simply a pawn in a larger conspiracy? The question of whether he was driven by personal reasons or a sense of criminal enterprise remains a topic of debate. 16th Hauptmann's trial, the legal drama. The trial of Bruno Hauptmann was one of the most publicized legal proceedings of the 20th century. It was a spectacle that captivated the nation, with newspapers providing daily updates on the trial's progress. The case became a symbol of the American judicial system, with the outcome of the trial viewed as a test of justice and fairness. Hauptmann's defense team argued that he had been framed, but the prosecution presented strong evidence, including his fingerprints on the ransom notes and his possession of the ransom money. Despite the circumstantial nature of much of the evidence, Hauptmann was convicted of both kidnapping and murder on February 13, 1935. The trial was highly controversial for a number of reasons. First, the rapidity with which the trial proceeded raised concerns that Hauptmann was not given adequate time for a fair defense. Second, the overwhelming media coverage and public pressure may have swayed both the prosecution and the jury. Many legal experts believe that the trial was tainted by these factors, raising questions about the fairness of the judicial process. Despite these concerns, the jury convicted Hauptmann and he was sentenced to death. On April 3, 1936, Hauptmann was executed by electrocution at New Jersey State Prison, ending the trial but not the public debate over his guilt. 17. Theories of innocence and doubts over Hauptmann's guilt. Even after Hauptmann's execution, questions about his guilt persisted. Several theories have suggested that Hauptmann was innocent and that he was wrongfully convicted. Some have argued that he was the victim of a conspiracy, either by the police or by other criminals who used him as a scapegoat. There were also claims that the evidence against him was circumstantial and that the true kidnappers were never caught. There are numerous unanswered questions about the case, including whether the ransom money found in Hauptmann's possession was planted, whether his fingerprints on the ransom notes were genuine, and whether the evidence was mishandled during the investigation. Over the years, new evidence and theories have emerged, leading some to question whether Hauptmann was truly the kidnapper and murderer. These doubts persist, even decades after his execution, and the case remains one of the most controversial criminal trials in American history. 18. The continued fascination and legacy of the Lindbergh kidnapping. The Lindbergh kidnapping case has had a lasting impact on American culture and criminal law. The case became a symbol of the intersection between celebrity, crime, and justice, and it continues to captivate people's imaginations to this day. Books, documentaries, and films about the case have continued to fuel interest in the events surrounding the kidnapping, the investigation, and the trial. The Lindbergh's tragic loss, combined with the sensationalism of the case, has kept it in the public consciousness for nearly a century. Beyond the media spectacle, the case has had a lasting effect on how law enforcement handles missing persons and kidnappings. The creation of the Lindbergh Law, the increased involvement of the FBI in such cases, and the changes in how law enforcement investigates high-profile crimes all trace their origins back to this infamous case. In addition, the unresolved questions about Hauptmann's guilt have kept the case alive as a topic of speculation and debate. Whether or not Hauptmann was the true perpetrator, the case has remained a powerful reminder of the complexity of justice and the lasting impact of a crime on both its victims and society as a whole. 19th. Conclusion: the enduring mystery. Despite the passage of time, the Lindbergh kidnapping remains one of the most infamous and debated cases in American criminal history. The tragic loss of a child, the dramatic trial, and the questions about Hauptmann's guilt have made it a case that continues to be revisited by historians, criminologists, and the general public. The Lindbergh case is a powerful reminder of the fragility of life, the complexities of the criminal justice system, and the ways in which the media can shape public perception. It is also a case that demonstrates how one tragic event can leave a lasting mark on a nation, its legal system, and its collective memory.